Picture this: a narrow strip of water, barely 20 miles across at its tightest point. 2 shipping lanes, each about 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone that exists for one reason only: to keep tankers from colliding with each other in the dark. On one side of that gap sits the Iranian coastline. On the other side sits roughly a fifth of the entire planet's daily oil supply, floating through in slow, fully loaded tankers that cannot turn quickly, cannot dodge, and cannot defend themselves. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and for the better part of this year, it has been the single most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. And then, according to the headline you clicked on, something happened. Iran activated hundreds of speedboats. Not one, not a dozen, hundreds. And somewhere out past the horizon, the United States military sent something back. That is the claim. That is what brought you here. So let's be honest with you before we go any further, because that is the only way this channel knows how to do this. We spent real time trying to find the source of that exact claim. A single dramatic day, hundreds of boats activated, a direct American response sent back in kind. We looked for it from CENTCOM. We looked for it from Reuters. We looked for it from the Associated Press. We looked for a named Iranian official or a named American official confirming that precise sequence of events on a specific day. We could not find it. What we found instead was a wave of secondary commentary videos repeating the same headline without ever pointing back to a documented, sourced event. So we are not going to stand here and tell you that one dramatic showdown happened on one specific day this week when we cannot prove it did. That is not how this channel works. And if that is disappointing, stick with us anyway, because what we can tell you, with real sourcing, backed by named analysts, official statements, and multiple independent outlets, is a story that is in some ways far more unsettling than a single headline could ever capture. Because the pattern behind that title is real. It has happened again and again for almost 2 decades. And right now, in the middle of August 2026, the conditions for it to happen again are about as high as they have ever been in the history of this waterway. To understand why, you have to go back to February the 28th, 2026. That is the day everything changed. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of airstrikes against Iranian military and government targets. And buried inside that first wave of strikes was something almost unthinkable: the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with a number of senior Iranian officials standing beside him. It is, by any honest measure, one of the most consequential strikes in the modern history of the Middle East. A leader who had sat at the top of Iran's power structure for decades, gone in a single operation. Iran's answer came almost immediately, and it did not come in the form of missiles fired at Tel Aviv or drones sent toward American bases. It came in the form of a closure. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy began broadcasting warnings over open radio channels to every commercial vessel in range of the strait. No ship, they said, would be permitted to pass. Britain's Royal Navy quickly clarified that this closure carried no weight under international law, that Iran did not have the legal authority to shut a strait that both Iranian and Omani waters border. But then came the sentence that actually mattered, the one that sent tankers scrambling. Safety in the strait, the Royal Navy admitted, could not be guaranteed. That single line did more damage to global shipping than any missile could have. Tankers turned around mid-transit. Shipping companies rerouted entire fleets or simply parked their vessels in port and waited. Oil markets reacted within hours, not days. What followed was weeks of American and Israeli airstrikes, an entire campaign built around one specific goal: forcing that strait back open by destroying the Iranian capability to keep it closed. That campaign officially began on March the 19th, 2026, and it targeted everything Iran had built to threaten the waterway, naval vessels, radar stations, air defense batteries, and missile sites lining the coast. And here is the part of the story that most coverage glosses over. Those strikes worked, but only partially. American military assessments put the number of larger Iranian naval vessels destroyed at more than 150. Frigates, corvettes, the kind of surface ships that used to make up the visible, photographable backbone of Iran's navy. Gone. But here is the uncomfortable truth underneath that number. Those big ships were never really the point of Iran's naval strategy in the first place. For more than 2 decades, Iran's actual doctrine in the Persian Gulf has never centered on matching the United States ship for ship. It has centered on something much smaller, much cheaper, and much harder to permanently eliminate. Farzin Nadimi, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, who has studied Iran's naval posture for years, put it about as bluntly as an analyst can. When you talk about Iran's small boat fleet, he said, you have to think in the thousands, not the dozens. His estimate placed the total number of small, fast attack craft somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 vessels. Of those, he believed roughly 800 to 900 were equipped to carry anti-ship missiles, which makes that slice of the fleet the genuinely dangerous part. This is what people mean when they talk about Iran's so-called Mosquito fleet. Instead of building a handful of expensive, easily tracked warships, Iran spent decades building thousands of small, fast, disposable boats designed to overwhelm through sheer numbers and unpredictability. In a narrow, congested waterway, a United States destroyer might have only a few seconds to decide whether an approaching boat is a fisherman heading home for the evening or an armed threat closing for an attack. That decision window is the entire point of the doctrine. It is designed to make hesitation dangerous and aggression dangerous in equal measure. And crucially, this fleet was never sitting exposed in open harbors, waiting to be destroyed from the air. According to Nadimi's assessment, the boats are dispersed across the Iranian coastline and its outlying islands, many of them stored inside hardened tunnel complexes carved directly into rock. Some are launched straight into the water from underground facilities that no satellite photo can meaningfully assess. Others sit on trailers, moved inland whenever satellite coverage suggests they are being watched. And in some documented cases, boats have been hidden inside ordinary civilian buildings large enough to conceal them from above. That combination, mobility, concealment, and hardened infrastructure, is exactly why weeks of American and Israeli airstrikes could sink more than 150 larger warships and still leave the core of Iran's asymmetric threat almost completely intact. This is not new. It is worth remembering that Iranian fast boats swarming American naval vessels in the Strait of Hormuz stretches back well over a decade before this war ever started. In one widely documented incident from 2008, small Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats approached United States Navy ships in a serpentine weaving formation, broadcast threatening radio messages including a warning that the American vessels were about to explode within minutes, and prompted the Navy to formally describe the encounter as a significant provocative act. Iran, for its part, called it a routine misunderstanding. Separate footage from around that same period involving the American destroyer Nitsa showed 4 Iranian attack boats closing in fast in that same serpentine pattern, with a sailor heard over the radio describing the encounter as unsafe and unprofessional after repeated attempts at bridge-to-bridge communication went unanswered. Then, in 2021, the Pentagon publicly confirmed that 13 IRGC boats had approached 7 American vessels at high speed, closing to within roughly 140 meters, close enough that one American ship fired warning shots to force them off. Iran rejected that account entirely and accused the United States of provocation. The point here is simple. What is happening now is not some unprecedented escalation that appeared out of nowhere. It is the newest, most dangerous chapter in a playbook Iran has been running in this exact strait for close to 2 decades, refined through repeated close calls with the very navy it was built to deter. It also helps to zoom out even further, because the Strait of Hormuz has been a flashpoint before, and the parallels are almost eerie. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, in what became known as the Tanker War, both sides attacked oil shipping throughout the Gulf, and the United States eventually launched Operation Praying Mantis in April of 1988, a single-day naval battle that remains the largest surface engagement the United States Navy has fought since the Second World War, triggered after an American frigate struck an Iranian mine. That earlier war is a huge part of why Iran's military planners spent the following decades building exactly the kind of dispersed, hard-to-target, small boat force we are describing right now. The lesson Iran took from the 1980s was brutally simple. A conventional Iranian navy going ship to ship against the United States loses, and loses fast. But a narrow strait filled with mines, fast boats, and coastal missile batteries becomes a problem that no outside power can solve cleanly, no matter how strong its navy is on paper. Everything happening in the strait in 2026, the blockade, the swarm tactics, the hardened coastal tunnels, is really just the modern, far more heavily armed descendant of a strategy Iran began building in the wreckage of that earlier war. Because Iran's navy has never been able to match the United States carrier for carrier or missile for missile, and Iranian planners have known this for decades. What Iran can do is make the cost of operating in its own backyard high enough and unpredictable enough that even a vastly superior force has to think twice before pushing further. A narrow strait, thousands of cheap boats, hardened tunnels along the coastline, and a willingness to absorb losses that a state actor with limited alternatives can tolerate far better than a democracy watching casualty counts scroll across the evening news. That combination is the entire logic behind the Mosquito fleet, a strategy built on geography and asymmetry rather than raw firepower. And according to Nadimi's own assessment, it is precisely why this branch of Iran's military has outlasted the branch built around big, expensive, easily targeted surface ships. What makes the current chapter of this story different is the sheer scale of everything surrounding it. On April the 13th, 2026, the United States imposed a full naval blockade on Iran, following the collapse of talks that had been taking place in Islamabad. The stated goal was simple: block vessels from entering or leaving Iranian ports entirely. According to CENTCOM's own public statements, the blockade intercepted dozens of vessels within its very first week, with the running total reported at 23 by April the 18th. Lloyd's List, the shipping industry's most authoritative tracking publication, separately reported that by April the 20th, at least 26 ships had managed to slip past the blockade line in both directions. Iran's response came on April the 18th, when it reclosed the strait entirely, pointing directly at America's refusal to lift the blockade as justification. By the American military's own accounting, that blockade was costing Iran roughly $500 million a day in lost oil trade. And by May the 1st, the Department of Defense put the cumulative cost to Iran at $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue. Iran, in retaliation, seized 2 cargo ships. Then came Operation Project Freedom. On May the 4th, 2026, United States Central Command launched a military escort operation designed to physically guide merchant vessels through the strait, explicitly framed as the next phase following the earlier air campaign known as Operation Epic Fury. Over roughly a day and a half of active operations, 7 Iranian boats were sunk. A French container ship operated by the shipping company CMA-CGM was struck during the operation. By May the 5th, the operation had been paused, and on May the 6th, President Trump personally announced that pause, describing what he called great progress toward a possible complete and final agreement with Iran, and saying the delay was meant to give negotiators room to work. That pause did not hold cleanly. On May the 7th, 2026, the United States carried out a fresh round of airstrikes on southern Iran and on Tehran itself, described by American officials as strikes taken in self-defense following Iranian targeting of American warships during the Project Freedom operation and the ongoing blockade. It was in this exact window, mid-April into May, that the clearest public signal yet emerged about how Washington intended to handle Iran's surviving fast boat fleet going forward. In a post on his social media platform, President Trump warned that any Iranian boats approaching the blockade would be, in his words, immediately eliminated using the same system used against drug traffickers at sea, describing it as quick and brutal. That comparison was not a throwaway line. Since September of 2025, American forces had already been carrying out lethal strikes on suspected drug trafficking vessels throughout the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, a campaign that by that point had reportedly killed more than 160 people and destroyed dozens of boats. The administration was signaling quite openly that the same surveillance-driven rapid strike playbook used against cartel vessels could now be turned against Iranian fast craft inside the Strait of Hormuz. But analysts were quick to point out that the comparison only stretches so far. Nadimi's own assessment on this point was direct. In the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, the United States has been targeting non-state actors with essentially no ability to shoot back. In the Strait of Hormuz, American forces are confronting an organized state military, dispersed, coordinated, and in some cases armed with weapons, specifically designed to threaten aircraft and larger ships. Nadimi noted that many of Iran's fast boats are believed to carry man-portable air defense systems, shoulder-fired missiles capable of shooting down helicopters or low-flying aircraft, in addition to rockets and anti-ship missiles mounted on the larger craft. These boats are vulnerable to air power, Nadimi said, but they are also armed and they can use tactics to limit that vulnerability. In other words, the same swarm doctrine that makes these boats nearly impossible to permanently destroy in port also makes them genuinely dangerous once they hit open water, because a formation of fast boats moving unpredictably through a congested strait, some of them carrying anti-air weapons, is an extremely difficult targeting problem, even for the most capable navy on the planet. That is the backdrop against which Iran's posture through the summer of 2026 needs to be understood. Nadimi, speaking as the blockade dragged on for weeks, characterized Iran as operating in what he called a very defensive mode, focused on preserving what remained of the fleet and keeping it away from American surveillance. That meant dispersing boats even further, limiting their movement and avoiding detection by American drones and other intelligence assets wherever possible. Iranian state-aligned media told a much more defiant version of that same story. Hamshari, a daily newspaper with close ties to the Revolutionary Guard, dedicated front-page coverage in late July to describing the speedboat fleet as the winning card in the Persian Gulf, framing it as one of the central pillars of Iran's deterrence against any expansion of American attacks, and describing the fleet's swarm tactics as one of the most complex challenges facing American forces in the region over the past 2 decades. It is worth being clear that this is Iranian state-adjacent framing, not an independently verified assessment, and it should be read with that in mind. But it does tell you how Tehran wants this story understood. And that matters, because perception drives decisions on both sides of a standoff like this one. Even through a ceasefire that technically remains in place on paper, this war has kept producing real violence. In early July, Iranian state television aired footage of what it described as hundreds of thousands of mourners walking toward the Jamkran Mosque near Qom for a funeral tied to the killing of the former supreme leader. That same week, United States Central Command announced a fresh series of strikes on Iran, described as a direct response to Iranian attacks on 3 commercial vessels inside the strait, targeting Iranian air defenses, radar installations, and anti-ship missile sites. This is the rhythm this conflict has settled into. A ceasefire that technically holds in name only, punctuated by real strikes, real vessel attacks, and real casualties, all tied directly back to control of that 20-mile strip of water. And that rhythm has continued right into this month. As of the middle of August 2026, the United States and Iran remain locked in a genuine stalemate over the strait. A vessel affiliated with the United Arab Emirates State Oil Company was attacked on the night of August the 14th, inside the strait itself, with the UAE's foreign ministry blaming Iran directly and describing the strike as a flagrant violation of international law. In that same window, Iran and President Trump have been trading increasingly sharp public statements over who actually controls the strait going forward. Trump has said publicly that he intends to declare the strait United States territory once the war is formally over, a claim he repeated at a political rally, adding that Washington already controls it in practice. Tehran's response was blunt and immediate. A senior Iranian deputy foreign minister said the strait cannot be seized with a tweet, an aircraft carrier, an executive order, or a campaign speech, a direct rebuke aimed squarely at the American president. Control of Hormuz remains central to Iran's leverage in these negotiations, precisely because any disruption there ripples through global oil markets almost instantly, and Tehran knows that better than anyone. Separately, an Iranian military commander has claimed that pilots from 2 Iranian aircraft, shot down early in the war, are currently being held in Qatar, a claim the Qatari government has firmly denied. There's another layer to this story that most coverage of the strait leaves out entirely, and it matters, because it shows just how far this conflict has spread beyond Hormuz itself. While Iran and the United States remain locked in their standoff over that 20-mile gap, Iran's regional ally, the Houthi movement in Yemen, has opened an entirely second maritime front more than 1,000 miles away, at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. In mid-August, Houthi rebels killed 6 people aboard a cargo ship in that strait, the first reported fatalities from attacks on Red Sea shipping in more than a year. Within hours of that same attack, American forces separately reported firing missiles at a container ship that allegedly attempted to breach the blockade of Iranian ports in the Gulf of Oman. 2 incidents on 2 completely different waterways, on the same day, both tracing back to the exact same underlying war. The Yemeni port of Mocha has absorbed the worst of this second front. Houthi missile and drone attacks on the port across 2 consecutive nights in early August killed at least 18 people combined, with dozens more wounded. And Yemen's military says its air defenses managed to intercept 11 Houthi drones during just one of those 2 nights. By the middle of August, Mocha's port director confirmed the facility had suspended all commercial and maritime operations entirely, after being struck by more than 25 missiles over the preceding days, with total losses estimated at $16 million and 7 people killed. The Houthis have also declared a formal naval blockade against Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea, framed as retaliation for what they describe as a Saudi siege on Yemen, an accusation Riyadh flatly denies. Some international shipping companies have already begun quietly shifting toward the Red Sea route specifically because the Strait of Hormuz has become effectively off limits to normal commercial traffic. In effect, this war has made both of the Middle East's major maritime choke points dangerous at the same time, which is exactly why global shipping insurers and oil markets have started treating this as a 2-front crisis rather than a single contained standoff. None of this is happening in isolation from the global economy, and it is worth putting real numbers behind that, because the entire purpose of Iran's fast boat fleet is to keep this pressure alive. Brent crude prices jumped roughly 65% within the first month of the war, the largest monthly rise on record as the near-total disruption of shipping through the strait rattled energy markets worldwide. Projections at the time assumed the most acute phase of the disruption would ease within a couple of months, an assumption that, based on everything happening this August, now looks wildly optimistic. As of the middle of this month, Brent crude has climbed to prices roughly a quarter higher than they were before the war began in late February, and shipping traffic through the strait itself has fallen to a small fraction, in some recent weeks under 20%, of what it was before the conflict started. Energy officials do not expect Middle East oil production to return anywhere close to pre-conflict levels until early 2027 at the earliest. Analysts have been blunt about the underlying math. Global crude supply can only meaningfully increase once normal two-way traffic actually resumes through this exact 20-mile gap, which underlines just how much of the entire global energy system is currently hostage to that stretch of water. There is also a diplomatic dimension to all of this, because the fast boat fleet does not exist in a vacuum. It exists as one piece of leverage inside a negotiation that keeps stalling out. Through early and mid-August, Iran and Oman signaled they were close to reaching a separate agreement on how to manage navigation through the strait. But Iranian officials were quick to clarify that any such deal would not mean the strait reopens immediately, and that full reopening would require Washington to end the war outright, withdraw troops, and make a series of long-sought concessions. A 60-day negotiation window between the United States and Iran has now expired without a clear path to ending the conflict. In the days since, President Trump has threatened to attack Oman itself if it interferes with American efforts to control the strait, a striking escalation against a country that has spent months trying to act as a neutral mediator between Washington and Tehran. Trump has also continued to insist, publicly and repeatedly, that the strait is currently open and under American control, a claim directly contradicted by shipping data showing traffic still running at a small fraction of pre-war levels. It is also worth pausing on exactly who else is exposed here, because the Strait of Hormuz has never really been just an American and Iranian story. Every major Gulf oil producer, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, depends on this exact waterway to move the overwhelming majority of its exports, and none of them have the option of simply staying out of it. The UAE-linked tanker struck in mid-August is a direct example of that exposure. Emirati oil moves through the same 20-mile gap as everyone else's, regardless of who Abu Dhabi has or has not taken sides with. Qatar sits in an even more delicate position, both because of its role hosting American forces on its soil and because of the still-denied claim that it is holding captured Iranian pilots. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, is now dealing with the Houthi front directly as well, with Houthi spokespeople explicitly stating that recent strikes targeted what they call Saudi military assets. The United Kingdom has been hosting multinational talks aimed at securing the shipping route, and NATO members with naval assets in the region, including Britain's Royal Navy, have already been directly involved in responding to Iranian fast boat encounters, going back to that same 2008 Nizza incident and others like it. In other words, a swarm of Iranian speedboats in the Strait of Hormuz has never been a two-country problem. It is a pressure point that touches nearly every government with a stake in global energy markets, which is exactly why Iran keeps this fleet intact, rather than risking it all in a single decisive confrontation. So let's come back to where we started, because you deserve a straight answer. The underlying capability behind that headline is real and substantial. Iran's fast attack boat fleet, by the most credible open-source military estimates available, still numbers in the thousands of vessels, with several hundred capable of carrying anti-ship weapons, and it has survived a war that sank more than 150 of Iran's larger warships, specifically because it was built from the ground up to survive exactly that kind of campaign. Its boats are dispersed, hardened, and hidden along a coastline that Iran has spent decades studying for this precise purpose. The doctrine behind it, swarming deception, blending into ordinary civilian maritime traffic, using the narrow geometry of the strait against larger, slower vessels, is well documented, well understood by American military analysts, and has been demonstrated in real, confirmed incidents going back to at least 2008. The United States, for its part, has signaled clearly through the president's own public statements that its response doctrine borrows directly from a lethal, surveillance-driven counter-narcotics playbook already used at scale in the Caribbean, now adapted for a far higher stakes environment against an actual state military inside one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. What we cannot verify, and what we will not present to you as confirmed fact, is a single discrete event in which Iran activated hundreds of these boats on one particular day this week, followed by a specific, named American countermeasure sent directly in response. If and when CENTCOM, Reuters, the Associated Press, or another named checkable source confirms an event matching that exact description, it deserves its own dedicated coverage with its own sourcing. And we will bring it to you the same way we have tried to bring you everything else in this video, sourced, dated, and honest about what is confirmed versus what is still developing. Here is the bigger picture we are all sitting inside right now. The Strait of Hormuz has narrowed the entire global economy down to a 20-mile bottleneck for decades, and Iran built an entire branch of its military around exploiting exactly that geography. What we are watching this August is not a single dramatic swarm boat showdown captured on video and uploaded within the hour. It is a slow-burning standoff, now nearly 6 months old, where both sides have already used lethal force repeatedly, where a ceasefire exists mostly on paper, and where the mere presence of thousands of hard-to-target Iranian speedboats sitting in hardened coastal shelters is itself a form of pressure, whether or not a single one of them moves on any given day. The blockade, the funeral processions in calm, the tanker strikes, the fight over who gets to call this strait their own. These are all pieces of the exact same standoff, and the fast boat fleet sits at the center of it, ready, dispersed, and, according to every source we could verify, still very much intact. So here is what we actually want to know from you. Given everything Iran has managed to preserve despite months of American and Israeli strikes, do you think the United States can realistically neutralize that fast boat threat without launching a far larger, far riskier ground and coastal campaign? Or is the Strait of Hormuz simply a place where a state actor with home field advantage and thousands of cheap hidden boats can outlast even the most capable navy in the world, no matter how long Washington is willing to wait? Drop your answer below. Tell us which side of that question you land on, and if you want us to keep tracking this the moment something changes, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is nowhere near finished. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.